All financial support for this podcast comes from my patrons on patreon.com. If you'd like to join in with patrons, please check out patreon.com/DarwinGrosse. That's DarwinGrosse. Now enjoy the podcast. Okay, today I get a chance to talk to somebody new. He's actually someone that one of the listeners suggested, and when I started looking into this guy's work, I was really pretty blown away. It really spoke to me in a really profound way. His name's Scott Nordlund. His artist name is, in talking with him, it's like we don't necessarily have a pronunciation. I would call it acreil, I guess. It's Acreil. Has a number of releases on Bandcamp, but also is very active in the pure data coding community. And so I'm really excited to learn more about his work and his process. So with that, let's talk to Scott. Hey, Scott, how's it going?
It's going okay. I'm a little hot and sweaty.
Yeah.
Outside.
Yeah, it's that time of year when that's going to start happening, right?
In the southeast, it starts a little earlier than that.
Yeah, indeed. So why don't we start off by having you talk a little bit about your work, the kinds of things that you do as your artistic practice.
Well, I guess I've always kind of been interested in generative music and algorithmic composition and chaotic sound synthesis and microtonal music and those kinds of things. For a while when I was starting out, I didn't have much of an opportunity to really do what I wanted to, but since I started using Pure Data, I can kind of do pretty much whatever I want. And I've kind of checked off all those boxes, I think, and satisfied all those desires. I got to where I wanted to be.
That's actually an interesting way of putting it. One of the things I'm curious about in your case is when I went to Bandcamp, I saw you actually had a large number of releases out there.
Yeah.
What is it that for you sort of represents, I mean, if you were like to explain what it is that your work is doing. I mean, Pure Data is literally the blank sheet of paper, right? It can do whatever you're compelled to do. What would you say is the thing that kind of represents your voice?
Oh, I don't know. I don't think I particularly have any kind of sound at all. I mean, I do stuff that's entirely different from that as well, with, home keyboards and I'm multi-tracking and playing by hand and that kind of thing.
Uh-huh.
And I don't know. I don't really necessarily have any goal going into it. Usually it's just I'm trying some kind of say like making a new kind of filter or something, and I just kind of mess around patching stuff with that just to try it out. And then that suggests somewhere else to go. I mean, I don't work to any kind of manifesto or anything. I have preferences and I have interests, and that's about it.
That's interesting. That's actually kind of cool, because what it means is you are giving yourself kind of the privilege of being able to go wherever your senses take you. And it's interesting because as I was listening to your work, I kind of went back to some of the older stuff. And I was surprised it had a very different sound, I guess, from the newer stuff. I ended up like really getting hooked on the album called Sample Item with Diameter 32. I don't know what it was about that album, but I sort of couldn't stop listening to it. It really sucked me in. I'm curious, the name Sample Item with Diameter 32, does that come from a specific thing, or is it just like random words that you glued together?
So I kind of feel like titles aren't really that important, and it's just kind of this space to sort of play around, at least if you're doing relatively abstract music,
Right.
But I like to have kind of a theme or something for a specific release that in some kind of way ties them together. It doesn't have to be something that's like an explicitly stated concept or anything like that, but I don't know. I have a big collection of titles, more than releases or pending works or anything. I have this large archive. Sometimes I just collect words that I think sound interesting and then just kind of stick them together in different ways.
Uh-huh.
But those in particular, I was watching YouTube videos, and you know how it's got the auto-generated subtitles, right?
Right.
And it can translate it to English from whatever language.
Uh-huh.
So if a video contains more than one language, then it's going to try to translate it as all the same language, right?
Okay.
It only identifies one
Oh,
language.
sure, right.
And so the stuff that's not correctly identified is going to come out as complete gibberish. And so I watched a number of these videos, and I started collecting these really weird phrases from them, because there was kind of a lot of them.
Right.
And I accumulated a bunch of them, and so then I kind of just started sticking them together.
Oh, that's freaking brilliant. I love it. That's
I
hilarious.
don't know. I just saw it. I was watching something, and there was all this gibberish on the screen, and I thought, well, I need to do something with that.
Well, I think there's actually something to that mistranslation stuff that's fun. You know, where I run into it is with the interviews that I do now. I also do
Uh-huh.
transcriptions of them, and I use this
Yeah.
automated transcription service that's just a shell around the Google Translate system.
Yeah.
But especially if I'm working with somebody, I mean, I've got kind of a goofy accent myself, but if I'm working with somebody else with a different accent, it is some really bizarre translation attempts come out of that thing. And while it gives each word a score, sometimes it's
Uh-huh.
really, really sure that that it's right, and it couldn't be farther from from correct. So it's actually interesting to get some of those. I never really thought of that as being like something that I should be collecting, though. That's actually really smart.
Well, I think if you think of that, working with art and technology and that kind of thing, I think it's important to notice failures and errors and things like that. And those kind of change over time. I mean, it used to be like structural film and things like that, sort of exploiting the artifacts
Uh-huh.
of like 16 millimeter films. And as media changes, the failures and the errors kind of change along with them. And I figured that it's kind of a good fit if I'm trying to do algorithmic music. I mean, it's not artificial intelligence because it doesn't employ any kind of machine learning or anything like that.
Right.
But this kind of failure of artificial intelligence, where it's sort of transliterating one language into another into some sort of complete nonsense, and then machine translating that into English and just generating all this gibberish. I don't know. I thought it kind of fit.
Well, it does. I mean, it's hilarious because I don't know how I never made the connection, but you just actually made this connection for me, which is like, the kind of some of the original modern glitch artists, they were taking
Yeah.
advantage of like D to A converters not being able to handle a scratched CD or something like that, right?
Right.
And so it would just like produce gibberish. I never made the connection of that with like the modern things we see, whether it's like scrambled JPEGs or bad
Right.
translations of text or whatever. But of course I should have, because that's exactly what it is. You're right.
Well, I mean, people did stuff like that with, say, image files. They did data bending. I don't know if anybody still does that anymore. But like, you open a image file in a text editor and you start overwriting parts of it, and then you open it, see what the image looks like.
Right, right. Yeah, exactly. Well, it's still happening. I recently saw somebody do actually a performance doing that live, and it was quite a bit of shredding. It was pretty amazing. Now, one of the things that I came out of listening to your music, wondering though, is how you composite this stuff. Because as a pure data programmer, I can imagine a lot of these sounds being developed as patches.
Uh
But
huh.
you also have kind of a greater layer that's like a structural layer, so for the structure of the piece and even the structure of the albums, it seems like you're employing something else, but I don't know what it is. Am I correct in assuming that you have other technology to use, or are these all self-constructed PD patches that produce the entire work?
It depends a lot. Some of the stuff is just a straight pure data patch, and on the largest time scale, it's pretty much completely static,
Okay.
right? So I've got all this sort of randomization and automation controlling all these individual sounds, but on the whole, it's not progressing anywhere, right? And in
Hmm.
those cases, I just sort of record a bunch of it and pick an excerpt.
I see.
Um,
Okay.
Other ones contain some amount of high-level automation. Basically, I make a patch that's got a bunch of delay things and basically envelopes and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And that will control, say, the amplitudes of different parts and that kind of thing. And so that'll change over the course of the piece. And that's, that's automated. That's not randomized.
Right.
That's something that I am explicitly kind of composing, I guess, constructing it that way.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'll just record the output of the patch that way. Other stuff is made from multiple different patches. So I might record one sound with one patch and another sound with a different patch, and then reprocess one of the sounds, one of the recordings, through another patch, and then just mix it all together in some just really basic audio editor. I'm using Audacity currently because all I'm doing is just mixing them together in a super basic way, not applying any effects or anything.
Oh wow! So literally all the effects are part of your PD patch that's doing the originating sound.
Yeah.
Oh, holy shit, that's wild.
Well, I mean, I was always interested in things like reverberation algorithms, and so I figured I'd start developing them, and then some of them got kind of good, and then I made some other stuff, and that got kind of good, and I don't know, I have a pretty decent set of them now, so
yeah,
I don't need to use anything external.
That's amazing because my expectation was that you were going to say that you use something like Reaper or Logic or something like that to do kind of large form compositing, because some of these compositions are pretty I wouldn't use the word ornate, but definitely complicated. And it's really interesting to think of this being sort of like scaled sets of patches where maybe you're doing source material creation, and then the next level is like playback and mixing with automation and all that stuff. That really sounds like that takes a lot of organization in your mind just to be able to pull it off.
Oh, not really. I don't think it's that hard. I mean, most of the stuff that's happening in the patch is randomized or whatever. It's some kind of a systematic part of the patch. I'm not having to specify it. All the automation that I'm doing deliberately, I might have maybe like 10 or 12 different things at the most that I'm controlling.
Okay.
But it's really just like fade in at this point, fade out at this point.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And it's usually that simple.
Interesting.
And when I'm mixing the stuff externally in Audacity, there might be, I don't know, I mean, the number of tracks that I'm mixing might vary a lot, but it's usually like maybe 6 or something stereo tracks. And again, I'm just doing the same thing, like fade in here, fade out here. Right. And if I listen to it and I hear, this part I don't like, I'll just kind of mute it for that point and fill it up with something else.
Right.
So, I mean, compared to what a lot of people do, I think the mixing stuff and the automation is really pretty basic. I try to make everything kind of randomized and process-based kind of as much as possible. I try to rely on that.
Interesting. I'm kind of blown away because what you're doing is you're doing really complex work, but it also sounds like all the complexity is in building these voices, and then the rest of it, the compositing and mixing and all that stuff, you're sort of allowing the quality of the voices themselves to sort of carry the day.
When I started, I mean, I think that's just because, let me think about that.
No worries.
If you approach it kind of like a knob twiddler kind of a thing, as opposed to sort of a composer.
Yeah.
I mean, I kind of frown upon that kind of stuff, that sort of self-indulgent knob twiddly stuff. Yeah. But you tend to just kind of let things go and let things sort of drone on. Whereas if you're approaching things like, say, an electroacoustic composer, especially somebody like, Stockhausen or whatever, I mean, there might be like hundreds of edits in a minute, right?
Right.
Where the sounds are very simple, but the process of putting things together is really complicated. And I think just kind of the fact that people tend to approach things now more as knob twiddlers, and people kind of screwing around and improvising. Maybe I think that's sort of an influence, because I mean, when I would do stuff earlier, it was kind of boring and not that good, but it would be of that sort of thing, just kind of record this sort of droning thing and fool around with it for a while.
Tweak on it while it goes, right? Yeah.
Right. And so, I figured I don't have to be tweaking on it with my hands, because Well, I mean, one, you've only got two hands, and there might be potentially a lot of different controls.
Right.
You know, it's also really kind of easy to get confused when you're doing something like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. Absolutely.
And you're twiddling some knob, and you're like, is this changing the sound or not? And then you realize that you're messing with the wrong thing, and you've been doing that for the last 30 seconds and not doing anything.
You're turning a knob
So
in a
I
part of
figured,
the patch that isn't even, that's like muted or something.
right.
Yeah.
And, you know, I figured with, like, if you listen to, like, Tangerine Dream or, like, Berlin School kind of stuff, so it's worse for them because, one, they were probably really high.
Right.
And, you know, two, there's, like, three people all doing stuff independently.
Right.
It's kind of hard to even keep track of what you're doing. Then you might be listening to what somebody else is doing while you're messing around with, like, twiddling your knobs.
Right.
And be confused as to what you're doing there. So I figured that the bar is kind of low for randomly messing with stuff.
Sure.
If you can just kind of affect different parameters over time in some kind of an organic kind of a way, such that it's always different, it doesn't repeat. I mean, that part isn't really that hard.
Well, but what's interesting is what you're talking about then is actually kind of, I mean, in a way, it's a little bit in between the knob twiddling in that you're not necessarily twiddling the knobs, you're building these systems that do it, but you're not like hyper obsessing over doing the 50 edits a minute kind of a thing. You're building a system you're building a system that expresses your composition.
Well, yeah, and so the thing is, I'm too lazy to do the edits.
Okay. I love
so that's
it.
why I do it, right?
Interesting, yeah.
Because that takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of, like, you know, decision making, and I don't have the capacity for that.
Sure. Well, that's cool though, but you know, it's that decision making process that also ends up being part of what makes your artistic voice, I think. And you know, listening to your stuff, I would say that you have a voice. It's really quite beautiful. Now, before we go down that ramp too much farther, I want to talk about something that's kind of key to my podcast, and that is learning about how people got to be the artist and creator that they are.
Uh-huh.
And I'm curious in your case because, you know, first of all, it sounds like you have some very particular ways that you think of music, and it's not just arbitrary. It sounds like you've put a lot of thought into this. You know, it's some very informed decisions based on what, you know, on your thoughts about music and music creation over history, I guess. But also, a lot of it is very now oriented. I mean, really kind of coding as an artistic practice, and specifically this idea of building all your own tooling or the majority of your tooling that you use, you know, through these PD patches and stuff. I'm kind of curious where you're coming from because this is not going to be the standard I learned to play piano and joined a band kind of story.
So you're onto me already.
A little bit.
So I always liked music, but I was mainly attracted to strange synthesizer sounds and things like that. And so from the time that I was like 4 years old or so, my favorite band was always Devo.
Uh-huh.
And I was always interested in that kind of thing. You know, aside from that, also things that are sort of harmonically really sort of strange and do a lot of unexpected things, which also shows up a lot in what I do. I wasn't really all that interested in a lot of normal music. So I'm rather embarrassed to admit this, but I was raised Southern Baptist.
Oh.
And my grandmother would like sing and play piano in a church.
Mm-hmm.
So they had a piano at their house, and I would mess around with it. Well, I mean, you know, really I was more interested in like the inside of the piano, and if I had figured out how to take the front of it off, I would have gone all like John Cage on it. But fortunately for them, I didn't know how to take the front panel thing off. So my grandmother noticed me messing around with the piano like frequently, and kind of made me take piano lessons when I was 6 maybe.
Okay.
And I always hated it. And I was the laziest imaginable piano student, and I never practiced, and I hated playing because it just made me uncomfortable. It just gave me this anxiety. And I still really don't like playing. So at the first opportunity, I quit when I was, I don't know, maybe 7.
Okay.
because I don't know, I couldn't stand it, and it was dull, and there was nothing about it that I liked because I didn't see any potential there for me, because I saw, the only future that I really saw was I'm going to be the person playing piano in church. I mean, it did not occur to me that, Mark Mothersbaugh in Devo is actually, playing all those parts. That's, at least on the early Devo albums, that's not a sequencer, right? They're playing all that stuff by hand.
Yeah.
And they are really, really, really tight. And so they're playing that stuff really well. That didn't occur to me that piano practice would ever translate to Devo. It only seems to me that it would translate to playing piano in a church. And I have to say that white Southern Baptist church music is the dullest thing on the planet. And I didn't really want any part in that, so I quit. I mean, it would have been nice if I had some kind of like mentor or something, but I didn't really have anything.
Yeah.
And so then I was later told that one of the people that was like my, I don't know, second piano instructor, she cried when she heard that I quit because she thought that I was such a promising student. And I thought, well, I mean, that's news to me because I was like really lazy, but I guess despite not practicing ever, I did actually manage to learn it. So I guess I picked it up pretty quickly. So after that, I didn't do anything until I was like 14. And I was, at this point, again, interested in the idea of music, but I didn't know how to approach it. I didn't have any kind of guide. I was interested in electronics, and I was building electronic stuff. So I started collecting like tape recorders, and then I was messing with them so they'd play the tape backwards. And I was building, basic electronic circuits to make horrible beeping sounds and collecting things that made strange sounds. And so when I was around 15 or so, I kind of tried experimentally making some recordings with that. I mean, knowing kind of that this was not going to be a conventionally musical venture, and I didn't really have much taste for such, radically avant-garde stuff at the time.
Right.
But it was kind of just desperation. And that stuff, I mean, it was garbage, but it was an interesting thing to explore. And so I was at that point listening to like Warp Records kind of stuff. And I don't know, I kind of, this is sort of overly naive, but it seemed obvious to me that listening to that stuff, it seemed like if you can just use a computer, you don't really need any kind of conventional musical skill. I had always figured at that point that I was completely hopeless as far as any sort of instrumental performance goes, and that the only way that I'd be able to do anything is if something like probed my brain and read my thoughts. But the computer, or the illusion of the computer anyway.
Right. Yeah.
The idea of the computer seems to me some kind of a salvation. Well, I started using Buzz Tracker, and it kind of sucked. And I started using, buying hardware stuff. I was reading a lot of interviews with experimental kind of people at the time, like, Frank Zappa and Wendy Carlos and I guess Morton Subotnick or something. And so I didn't realize this till later when I was going through old stuff from high school, but I had sketched out when I was about 16 kind of the goals that I wanted to pursue musically. And it's pretty much all the stuff that I'm doing now. I had completely forgotten about that, but I wanted to do all this like algorithmic microtonal stuff, and I wanted to do like chaotic sound synthesis and, program sounds such that they don't repeat. Make some kind of music that potentially goes on for any length of time that you want. I had kind of forgotten about that, but I guess the ideas kind of stayed with me. But, it was a kind of a really long time before I was able to explore those in any kind of useful way.
Okay.
The stuff I was messing with for a long time wasn't really capable of that. I mean, I'd try and sort of make a little bit of progress, and I guess in the process got pretty good at programming sounds. It was good practice.
Programming sounds on what?
Well, just like hardware synthesizers and stuff.
Okay.
And I mean, so I wanted to do like some kind of chaotic sound, right? Something that wouldn't ever repeat, and would always be unpredictable. And so I was using like an Ensoniq EPS sampler. Okay,
yeah, that's what I was wondering. What kind of platform were you trying to do this on? Because, like a simple analog synth would have kind of run dry on some of that pretty quickly. It's interesting. Okay, so an EPS was one of the tools.
Basically, what motivated me at the time, this was like 2000, 2001, and I was like 16. I didn't really have a lot of money, and people were starting to get on this like analog bandwagon thing.
Uh-huh.
The prices were not as inflated as they are now, but they were starting to go up.
Right.
And it was well past the point where you could buy something really cool in a pawn shop for $200.
Okay. All right.
I mean, I went in the pawn shops and it wasn't promising.
Right.
And so since I wanted to do like esoteric, complicated stuff, I mean, I was pretty firm in that. I figured that I would just get the most sophisticated, overcomplicated, difficult to use digital stuff that I could afford.
Okay.
Right?
Right.
I just, and I'd read the user manuals and I'd think about it and I think this seems really promising.
Uh-huh.
I bet nobody's ever actually used this in this way.
Right.
But if you take this really not very sexy digital synthesizer and you program the hell out of it, probably it's going to do something really weird. And I was just, excited by those possibilities.
Yes.
So I list all the gear that I use on most of the releases. It wasn't really anything that spectacular.
Uh-huh. But you programmed the teeth out of them. You programmed them like crazy.
Well, I tried to.
Yeah.
I mean, looking back, I probably could have done better, but I mean, for 16, it was okay.
Uh-huh.
Anyway, there's no formal education here. When I went to college, I studied electrical engineering.
Okay.
Never any formal musical training.
Interesting. Now, I do in fact have about 1 million questions, but before I get to those, what was the point at which you jumped from hardware synths into pure data? Because that is obviously something that was a sort of a sea change for you.
Well, okay. So the thing is, I don't really think I particularly evolve. It's kind of more that I'm doing 10 different things at the same time.
Oh, okay.
So everything's kind of ongoing simultaneously.
Oh, all right.
Or at least I'll work on something for a couple months and then try, work on something completely different.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of most of the strains of what I'm doing stylistically have kind of always been there in one capacity or another. And so it's not like I'm making some kind of a, transition from one thing to something completely different. I'm kind of doing all these in parallel.
Okay.
But I started using Pure Data in, I think, 2008. And I was really just kind of messing around with it at first. I mean, I'd used Reactor briefly before that, but didn't really get anything very satisfactory out of it. I guess the first stuff that started happening with Pure Data that was any good was around 2010 or so.
Mm-hmm.
That was still kind of early. I guess maybe I don't think I really got good until a little later. But I mean, I was serious in Pure Data in like 2010.
Got it. Interesting. So, all right, this helps me kind of like piece together some things because, and the reason I say that is because I had, in preparing for this conversation, I did a little research on you, and I dug into your WordPress site.
Yeah.
Which was this like crazy quilt combination of like really super detailed deep dives into the technology of different kinds of synths. You know, to the point of like pulling and dumping the EPROMs, or like doing a deep review of the chips that were in the sound engines and stuff. And now I kind of get where that's coming from. That's this idea of let's take a thing that maybe had a common use and let's see what is in there that might be able to be made much more complex, or where is the complexity that I could tap, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, like a lot of that is, if you look at a DSP textbook and you look at, say, reverberation, design, chorus, or, filter, oscillator, whatever, it's going to give you just like one totally standard design that's probably not really that good. And I think a lot of people that get into this stuff kind of assume that if you see it presented in that kind of a way, that's kind of all there really is to it.
Right.
I think that's why a lot of VSTs in like the early era of them like sounded kind of really bad.
Yeah, no kidding.
And why people said, hardware always sounds better than VSTs until like relatively recently, like a few years ago, right?
Right.
But if you look into commercial hardware, if you look into old like computer music journal articles, patents from different companies, you'll see for each of these things a sort of a tremendous diversity in different techniques.
Uh-huh.
And all of them kind of have a characteristic sound, and some of them are kind of known and iconic, and some of them are unknown and unexplored.
Mm-hmm.
And so I figured that in digging into those things, well, one, there's a much broader range of ideas to explore.
Right.
And two, I don't have to feel like, mystified the way a lot of people seem to kind of fixate on certain pieces of hardware as though they have this kind of a magical sound.
Right.
If I understand how it works, then I could make it sound like that in software, or I can make it sound kind of like that, but more the way that I want it to sound. And I've got kind of more control that way. And the third interesting aspect of that is that it kind of makes everything boring interesting again. Because you can look at all these like home keyboards that nobody cares about, 80s home organs and things like that.
Right. Yeah.
And technologically, they're actually really interesting because they have a lot of exotic, innovative, weird stuff that wasn't ever used in anything else.
Mm-hmm. Well, that explains you like digging into things like Seiko synths or the Worsley synths and stuff. That explains too. Yeah.
So the thing that inspired me to buy those kinds of things to start with is just that they were so obscure and marginal and weird that I thought that you must be able to do something really deeply perverse with them.
Right. Yeah.
And that's, always kind of what got me excited about something. But, beyond that, it's like a bunch of Casio home keyboards. Mm-hmm. Compared to synthesizers, might as well have like some kind of like arcane alien technology. In a lot of ways, they're really totally different from anything else. And it's not that the instruments themselves are that useful necessarily, but if I can figure out how they work and make some kind of a software implementation and kind of adjust that to my liking,
right,
then I can find a bunch of new things to explore, a bunch of not necessarily like totally novel, unprecedented sounds, but different flavors of things.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah. Yeah, you don't have to worry about necessarily making everything from whole cloth. You can use their ideas as a launching point for some experimentation.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, and so I don't think, a lot of what people are doing in like VSTs now is like trying to make really accurate emulations of things. Mm-hmm. But I tend to think it's more interesting to like see the unexploited potential of something. Like what variations could they have made to a certain instrument that would have made it maybe more interesting or more useful? And, since you can copy and paste things like endlessly, you think of, what if you had a Casio keyboard that had 100 detunable oscillators and whatever.
Right. With the background in electrical engineering and all of this kind of alien technology surfing that you're doing, have you ever been compelled to try your hand at hardware development?
That was initially kind of why I studied electrical engineering. I mean, like I said, I was into electronics first. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I was messing with that semi-seriously since I was about 10.
Right.
And I had tried to make, as I kind of mentioned earlier, some like basic like sound effect generator kind of circuits. Mm-hmm. Nothing really that great, but the way that I made it was all screwed up, and so it came out really weird.
Okay.
And so I, at that point, I wasn't really like, nobody really had pointed me in the direction of like, this is a synthesizer and it has these features. I think I had seen like a photo of a Mini Moog or something before, mm-hmm. but I didn't really like get how it worked.
Okay.
And so once I started exploring on the internet and I was, actually looking at these things, it kind of seemed really obvious to me that I should be like Raymond Scott or something. I figured that would be like the right direction to go into. Mm-hmm. Or there was some guy, Joe Paradiso, he works at MIT.
Right.
And he had on the Synth Museum website an interview where he had made this really big and elaborate modular synthesizer, and he would describe making, I think, like generative patches and things like that. So I thought, that's what I'm going to do. But I realized I really hate actually building stuff. I mean, it takes way too long, and I hate soldering, and I hate drilling holes, and I hate stripping wires, and I hate troubleshooting. It's tedious, And the thing that really grated on me was that if you want to really make something, then you need to decide before you make it, before you finalize it, all the controls that it's going to have
Okay.
and how you're going to use it.
Right.
And I didn't really have that kind of a foresight. And so it would always just kind of get bogged down at that point.
Sure.
And I figured that if I could just like make a prototype and that would be it, and that would be like the usable final product, and that would be so much better, then I could like mess with it and change it around easily.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out that Pure Data satisfies my needs that way much more because it basically is a prototype.
Right.
And then the added advantage of that is that you can, once you finish something, then you can copy and paste it as many times as you want, and it doesn't cost any extra.
Right.
I mean, you know that synthesizer guy, Jürgen Heibel, he died a few years ago.
Yeah.
And Aphex Twin bought some of his stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that was kind of initially the sort of thing that I envisioned myself doing.
Right.
But like, think of how much work that took.
Yeah, I hear you.
That's
I've worked side by side with these people, and you know, this one thing that you say that really resonates with me is this idea that you have to have like the knobs and the interface and what it's going to sound like. You have to have all that pre-cooked before you really get to do much experimenting. And so the potential for it to just like somewhere along that path just kind of feel disappointing, and you're just like, I don't even know why I'm going to follow up with this, you know?
Well, I mean, because you end up putting knobs on it that don't really do anything useful.
Right.
If you want to, and there's like way too many, and then it gets too expensive.
Yeah.
Or it's missing something that you wanted.
and it's
so
too late to revert the design. Yeah.
And so I would just find myself working on these prototypes, and I would make these test recordings with this prototype, and I'd get like kind of excited about that. But then I wouldn't know what to do, and it would kind of trail off. Or if I actually finished something, then I never used it again.
Right.
You know, I thought like doing stuff yourself, that's great, but I don't want it to get in the way of using it, of making music. I mean, I know Pure Data and Max and whatever, that's supposed to be like really time consuming and difficult and whatever, but it's actually very fast compared to building hardware.
It is. And well, the other thing is that you just actually said the sentence that this is all pointing to, which is that in the end, it's supposed to serve making music. And boy, I can't tell you the number of people that get involved. And it's not just hardware, it's software builders too. But the people that get so involved in the building that they forgot that they got into it because they enjoyed making music. And so that's what, you know, if we get down to the core of why I was so fascinated by your work, it's that. It's that, you know, I saw you doing these highly technical things. You know, I saw some of the Pure Data patches you were doing, and I was like, you know, this is technically amazing stuff, but it was also paired with the actual creation of music, and I was blown away. I just loved it.
You know, if you were wondering where I'm coming from and how I've developed my ideas, basically, I've tried a lot of things and I've examined a lot of things, and I've decided that the vast majority of them are not really satisfying in one way or another. And so just kind of by process of exclusion, I end up doing the things that I do that I didn't really set out to do them necessarily.
Well, that takes a lot of self-honesty, and you know what? A lot of times it's not easy for us to be honest enough with ourselves to say, this is the direction I need to not go because I shouldn't. That's interesting.
I tried that a lot. I found when I was younger, I guess I found myself sort of easily influenced by what other people said and did in their approaches, and I would kind of internalize this idea of this is what it means to be an artist. I have to go in this direction.
Right.
And so I would try that, and it just wasn't working for me. And I mean, I would do stuff with it that would be like, I guess it was okay at the time, but I'd lose interest in it, and I wouldn't feel like going down that path anymore.
Right. Well, Scott, unfortunately, our time is up. But before I let you go, have you got anything on the burner here that you're working on? Any releases that you're planned, or any like tech wonders that you've got at your fingertips that you're about to share?
So basically, what I want to say is that my working habits are terrible.
Okay.
And I alluded previously to doing a bunch of things kind of in parallel, right? Rather
Mm-hmm.
than evolving from one kind of a style to another.
Right.
But along with that comes just a complete disorganization. So I'm pretty much always working on like at least like 6 albums or something.
Okay.
At least I'm like, that's on my mind.
Right.
And generally, when I release something, it's because I'm really tired of thinking about it and I just want it to be out of my mind. But I've got 2 that are pretty much almost finished.
Oh, great. Cool.
And I don't know, if I were less lazy, then I could probably release like 7 albums this year.
Oh, wow.
And I mean, that's not like the end of it. That's just the stuff that's almost done right now.
I see. Wow. That's wild. That's fantastic. Is it just that when you get in a flow, you tend to be really prolific then?
No, I don't think I'm especially prolific. It's more like, well, I mean, like I said, my working habits are really bad. I get inspired by something, and then I obsessively work on it for a while.
Got it.
And then I reach some sort of an impasse, or for whatever reason, kind of run out of steam, and it just kind of sits there.
Yeah.
And it might sit there for 6 months or
Got it.
10 years, or who knows.
Right. Interesting. Well, cool. I'll be looking forward to this stuff whenever it does show up. It's like I said, I've become a fan, so I appreciate, regardless of what your work habits are, I really love the outcome.
Okay. Well, thank you.
All right. And well, with that, I am going to let you have the rest of your evening. Thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to have this chat.
You're welcome. I wasn't doing anything anyway.
Well, good for me. All right, man. We'll talk again soon.
All right.
Many thanks to Scott for having the great discussion about his world and how he does things. It's really interesting. He has such kind of really focused ideas about how things should work. Turns out to be really interesting for us to learn more about that. So if you have a chance, get out there and take a look at his work. Beyond that, I want to thank you all for continuing to listen, for the support of everyone that helps support me on patreon.com. And just for all the people that are sharing this podcast with their friends, family, and whatever. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, drop me a line, darwin.gross@gmail.com or ddg@cycling74.com will all work. Otherwise, I look forward to talking to you soon. Catch you later.